Okay, so hello and welcome back. Now let's talk about these blocks over here. And these are essentially nothing. This is one of the models that you can essentially use for numbers. We saw that essentially we had these different basically models for numbers. For example, we started essentially with these different boxes. So 1 2 3 1 2 3 4 and 5, and then you have, for example, for a group of 10 you would essentially something like this would be a group of 10. And then, for example, then you can do something like this: 1 2 3 4 and 5, and then that would be, for example, a 10 plus a 3, which is essentially a 13, right? Now this comes based on the essentially all of these models are basically are simply, you could say that they are based on the simple pebble method. So for essentially you, from the very beginning of time, what we have done essentially, we have used essentially a pebble, right? And or essentially we have used a stick. And for a 2 essentially we have used 2 sticks. For a 3 we have used 3 sticks. For a 2 we have used, for example, 2 pebbles. For a 4 we have used 4 pebbles, and so on and so forth, right? Now the problem with this model, of course, this is the same model that we are using all throughout the whole mathematics for all the models. But the problem with this model is that it gets very easily out of hand. Meaning that, suppose that I had, for example, thousands of these pebbles all together as loose pebbles. So of course, every time I wanted to do something with those pebbles, I'd have to I'd have to essentially count them one more time. Again, I'd have to count them one more time. It would just simply not be possible, right? So one thing that I can do is that I can stick to my pebbles. There is no problem with that. Meaning that I have basically, for example, 4 5 6 7 8 9 10 11 12 2 4 6 8 10 12. So that's 12 pebbles. And if you want to express this in the number system that we have today, that would be essentially a 12, right? Now, and of course you can keep increasing the number of your pebbles, and you would run into no problems if you know how to manage them. So one thing that you can do essentially to make it easier to manage these loose pebbles is that you can essentially put them in groups of 10, meaning that essentially I get 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 and 10, and I put in one group of 10, and then I have 2 loose ones, and so that's a 10 plus a 2. That would be essentially a 12, right? Now, another thing that I can do is that I can represent my pebbles in the form of a cube, meaning that I can draw a cube like this, something like this, and then basically I would have a cube like this. That would represent essentially one of my pebbles. The value of this, for example, would be 1, right? And then basically, if I had, suppose that I had, for example, 12 of these, for example, then I could essentially exactly do what's done right over here, meaning that I can put these cubes on top of one another and then group them together. So that's essentially 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 and 10. That's 10 cubes. That's essentially one of those cubes, and the value of each cube is a 1. So essentially then 10 of those cubes would be 10, and now it's been grouped together, so it cannot be, it cannot go loose, or they cannot be separated. So then every time you want to do something with that, you can move the whole thing together essentially. You don't have to keep counting every time you want to do something. So that's much tidier and much easier, right? So, and this is essentially the model that I usually use in my head in order to essentially to add. I don't do usually I don't do multiplication in my head, or essentially even division I don't do in my head. But addition and subtraction, well, whenever I have to, I will do it in my head, and I use essentially this simple model because it's basically based on essentially actually how numbers are actually made and how actually numbers work. Meaning that these groups of 10 are essentially they represent the tens place value, and these groups of ones, these represent essentially the ones place value. And then you can, of course, in your head, you can break them apart, you can put them together. It's very, at least to me, it comes very naturally. So now if I have, for example, 2 groups of 10 and 3 groups of 1, this number would be 23. And if I had, and if that's essentially Mahi's blocks, and Isha's blocks has essentially, she has 3 groups of 10 and 8 groups of 1, that's a 38. And now you can essentially do your addition using these blocks, meaning that you can, and of course, normally, essentially what you can do is that it's easier to put essentially similar things. You can just simply put them together, meaning that basically the groups of 1, you have 3 groups of 1 and basically 8 groups of 10. If I put them together over here, it becomes essentially 11 groups of 1, or essentially 11 ones. So the 11 ones I can keep over here, and then 2 plus 3, that's essentially 5 groups of 10. So the 5 groups of 10 I can put over here, right? Now, it would be okay if I had, for example, 5 ones or 6 ones or 7 ones, anything under 10. But then when it becomes greater than 10, you can essentially do the grouping essentially one more time, meaning that I have these 11 loose cubes over here, and then 10 of them I will put them together. Out of essentially 10 of these I can make a group of 10. So now essentially instead of having 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I have 6 groups of 10 and just one of these, meaning that essentially these 10 ones, instead of 10 ones, we have essentially used essentially one group of 10. And then you can count, meaning that you can say that now we have 6 groups of 10 and one group of 1, so that's a 61, for example. So this way you can essentially do your this was of course addition, but then you can do basically subtraction in this way as well. Or for example, a 36 plus a 40, for example, 7, you can again put them together in the exact same way. You can essentially 3 plus 4, that would be essentially a 7, so that's 7 groups of 10. And then basically 6 plus a 7, that's a 13 ones. The 13 ones, essentially what you will do is that 10 of them you will take away as one group of 10, and so then you have essentially 8 groups of 10 plus 3 loose ones. So 8 groups of 10 would be an 80 plus a 3 would be 83, right? So that's how you can do your calculation. Or for example, a 45 plus a 49, for example. Again, you can essentially put the groups of 10 together, put the ones together, meaning that, for example, in this case, for example, you have 5 ones and 9 ones. That's essentially 14 ones, right? So let me do this on a piece of sheet over here. So suppose that I have basically 45 I want to do basically 45 plus 49, right? 45 plus 49. So then I'm going to have essentially, for the 45, I have one group of 10, two groups of 10, three groups of 10, four groups of 10, and 5 loose ones. For the 49, that's a 45. For the 49, I have 1, 2, 3, 4 groups of 10, and then 1, 2, 4, 6, 8, and 9. That's a 49. Now I can essentially put these together. It's usually easier to go with the ones. So you have 5 ones here, and you have 9 ones here. So together that makes essentially 13 ones. 13 ones. And these 13 ones would be essentially 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 1, 2, and 3, right? Now what I can do is that these 10 ones, I can make a group out of them and then use it in order to make one group of 10, right? And so basically then I have 4 groups of 10, and again 4 groups of 10. I bring this group of 10 over here and get rid of this. So now in total I have 9 groups of 10. I have 9 groups of 10 and 3 groups of 1. Which means that essentially 9 groups of 10 would be a 90, and 3 groups of 1 would be 3, so that's essentially 93. And we had essentially the numbers that we have was 45 and 49, so that's a 14, 1, and 9, 94. There's something wrong here. There is something wrong here, and what is wrong is that we have 9 and 5 is 14. It's actually 14, so I need one of these over here. So then I have 4 groups of 1 left over here, and so then I have to write 90 plus 4 is equal to 94, which is essentially the number that we got here, right? And of course you can do the exact same thing essentially with all of these numbers, meaning that the ones you will put them together, and the tens you will put them together and add them, and that becomes essentially your number. And that's exactly what you do when you do essentially addition. So for example, suppose that you have essentially a 58. Suppose that you have essentially a 58 plus a 32, right? So a 58 would be essentially one group of essentially 5 groups of 10, right? That's 5 groups of 10, and 8, 2, 4, 6, 8. That's a 58, and then a 32 would be 1, 2, and 3. And that's a 32, and you want to add these numbers together. So what I do, as we did before, we put essentially all of these together. So that means that essentially 8 ones and 2 ones, that would be essentially 10 ones. So this whole thing over here becomes 10 ones, 10 ones, and instead of 10 ones, I will just use 1 groups of 10, and I will get rid of this. So now I can put all of these groups of 10 together. So now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So that's a 90. That's an 1890, right? So the exact same thing we do with the addition. For example, when you write 58 plus 32, and when you do the addition, first of all, essentially you put the groups of 1 together, as I did here. So 8 plus 2, that means essentially 8 groups of 1 and 2 groups of 1. We want to put them together. That's 10 groups of 1. And 10 groups of 1 is 1 group of 10. So I put a 1 over the groups of 10, and I put a 0 over here, right? And now I can put all of the 10s together. So that's 6 plus 3 is equal to 9, and then essentially it's a 90. Okay. So that's basically that. So you can essentially go through these if you like. Let me see. Okay, so now that's all about basically working with these blocks, and I will see you in the next video with a little bit of subtraction. Thank you.